over, or this will be recorded. And then I will be sharing all of this on my YouTube page so that you can come back and watch any of this later on, or if you missed my live from 2 weeks ago where we talked about Unit 1 and 2, all that good stuff, you'll be able to access those. Okay, so what we're talking about is we're talking about Units 3 and 4, or the years 1450 to 1750. Let me just go ahead and I'm going to show you this graphic one more time. I showed it to you at the last review as well, but this is just a really kind of overwhelming visual representation of what's going to be on the AP exam. And what I really want us to focus on, and why I wanted to bring this up again today, is that the two most important eras for you to study between now and the exam are Units 3 and 4, which is the era we're going to talk about today, and Units 5 and 6, which is the era we're going to talk about next week. Those are easily the two most important eras that you should be spending most of your time reviewing. So 2 weeks ago, we studied Units 1 and 2, and honestly, if you felt pretty good about that, if you go back and watch some review videos for Units 1 and 2, and you feel like you get the gist of it, that might be all you really do to review for those units, and that's totally fine. And then I'm also assuming that just the last 3 units, they're more recent. You're probably maybe still learning about them in class, or you just finished learning about them. There's stuff that's a little bit more familiar to you anyway. The 2 eras that students get mixed up the most on, and that honestly the bulk of the test is on, are these middle units, these middle eras right here. And so I'm really glad that you're here. You're in the right spot. And I want to make sure first that we can really clarify the difference between these 2 eras, because 1450 to 1750 and 1750 to 1900 are really easy to mix up, but that would be really bad on the exam, right? Like if you get an essay prompt that's asking about something happening from 1450 to 1750, and you write a beautiful essay all with evidence from the later era, that's not good. So I made up this just like really simple, I think kind of simple, way to hopefully distinguish between these 2 eras. Okay, so they are connected. The way that I think of this course is that basically Units 1 and 2, that first era, is like the context. 1200 to 1450 is sort of the context of the course. It's telling you, hey, here's what states were doing before basically the 2 hemispheres met. So before like the old and the new world, right, like discovered each other. This is what states were doing. This is kind of how states were controlling. These were the big trade routes. It was the Silk Road, that sort of thing. That's the context for these 2 units, because the theme of these 2 eras, the ones we're going to talk about today and next week, is like change over time. Is okay, we are going to watch a ton of things change and develop and grow over time. And we also want to be paying attention to like what things are kind of staying the same. So the era we're going to talk about today, we sometimes call the early modern era. And I like to think of this, yes, this is very Eurocentric, but it's the easiest way, at least for me to think about it, as this is like the rise of the West. So when we think about the West as Western Europe, what's going to become the United States, kind of the British Empire, what's going to be that world, the Enlightenment, that sort of thing. That world is kind of rising and becoming itself, becoming who we know it's going to be during this era. Then in the next era is when they dominate the globe. That's when we have like the British Empire, the sun never sets. That's when we have the United States kind of catching up with imperialism, all these other things going on. So same thing in this first era, this is like the age of exploration and early colonies, mostly in the Americas. So this era that we're talking about today is really dominated by Portugal and Spain. This is like the first wave, pun not intended, of colonization, and it's really focused on the Americas, and Portugal and Spain dominate it, right? Portugal's also dominating the Indian Ocean as they're going in and setting up trading posts, right? So this is that first wave, is Portugal, Spain, first contact on some of these continents. And keep in mind that back like in Asia, not a lot is changing in this first era. Like we sometimes think that, oh, we have Columbus explored the ocean blue, and then all of a sudden Europe was dominating the globe. Not at all. For this time period we're going to talk about today, these Asian gunpowder empires are still crushing it. They're still incredibly powerful throughout the Middle East, India, China, even in Russia developing. And it's one of the reasons, remember, why the Europeans are trying to find other ways around to get to the Indian Ocean, is because these gunpowder empires are so powerful in their way. So that's what's happening in this era, right? The Europeans are starting to rise. They're starting to come out of their dark age, their Middle Ages. They're starting to navigate and explore, but they're mostly focusing their time and attention on the Americas, where it's going to be easier to conquer because of disease, right? And the Asian gunpowder empires are still incredibly powerful. The Europeans aren't really going to mess with them very much in this era. And keep in mind that part of Africa is starting to get incorporated into this Western system, but mostly West Africa is being incorporated in via the slave trade. But like East Africa, still thriving on the Indian Ocean, right? So that's what's happening in this era. The next era, which a lot of students get mixed up, is when these sort of like early steps towards colonialism or whatever kind of explode into like global imperialism. And really what's going to happen in the next era that is key to that is industrialization. So again, these are the two eras that a ton of students get confused about and you get sort of mixed up, and it's really easy to do, which is why you should be really careful as you're reviewing to like keep these eras separate and in the right order. Don't do that thing where you make a bunch of flashcards and then you mix them all up to see if you figured it out. Don't do that. Keep all your flashcards, all your review materials, whatever. Keep the ones for 1450 to 1750 together and always review them before you review the next era so that you can make sure that you're not writing a beautiful essay set in 1450 to 1750 talking about the scramble for Africa, because all of a sudden that then isn't going to count, right? Okay, so I just wanted to kind of hopefully clarify this a little bit. And then I'm also looking at the chat. Let's see, we have other maritime empires we need to know besides the Portuguese. I think if you only for this era know one, the Portuguese is a good one to know, but I would know Spain and Portugal. I would know that Portugal is really innovating a lot more. They're creating kind of a new like maritime type empire, whereas Spain is really just creating a land-based empire just overseas, if that makes sense, right? So they're kind of going to be doing the same stuff that like the gunpowder empires are doing. They're just doing them across the ocean in what we now know as Latin America. So those would be the two though that I would really focus on, right? I mean, the British show up in North America during this era. So of course they're there, but they're not really dominating exploration and colonialism the way they're going to in the next era. Okay, great question. Okay, so with that, again, I want to remind us, like the review strategy for the AP World History exam is dates and details and facts should come last, right? The most important thing is that you understand like big ideas like this. It's most important that you can go 1450 to 1750 is like exploration, Spain and Portugal, gunpowder empires back in Asia, like that sort of thing. And then that you get down to some facts, which we'll talk about in a second, to support the big developments. The AP World History exam does not really reward just like straight memorization. If you just memorize as many terms as possible, it's actually not as useful to you. If you're going to memorize something, again, I would memorize the eras and like what are the major developments happening in those eras, which is what I'm going to do in this review. Okay. Oh, and another great question. We have, why were European powers like the British and the French slower to explore? And then what's the difference between the Dutch East India and the British East India? Really good questions. Let me pull up this map. Okay, so I have this map of the powerful states that are kind of in existence for this era. I do want to mention that this map and many others come from a review packet I have. You have to pay for it. It's $10. It has like tons of review maps and timelines and notes outlines. So if you want that, I'll make sure it's linked in the description. But basically, in this first wave, why did Spain and Portugal get there first? So really good question. For one, they were the most united and the most innovative. So Portugal, like the Prince Henry's navigation school, is going to be really important, right? Another thing is that they just kind of like get out there first and they kind of call quote unquote dibs. The other thing I will say is that Spain and Portugal have a more well-developed absolute monarchy where it's like the king along with the Pope can unite together and just like send people out. And that unity of purpose allows them to get out and explore fast. If you have the Pope on your side, you're like good to go. Think about what's happening in England and France right now, which is across Europe, we have the Protestant Reformation going on, and that's creating chaos in some parts of Europe. In England, chaos. Henry VIII, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, there's a civil war, they're chopping kings' heads off. Like they're currently fighting it out. So are the French. The French are fighting it out over, are we going to be Catholic or Protestant? What are we going to do? And so partly too, because they also have slightly more, I'm not even gonna say democratic, but like the English have kind of a slightly like constitutional system where the king or queen is kind of expected to slightly listen to what Parliament wants. It makes them a little bit slower to act on these sorts of things. And they're more concerned right now in England and France with consolidating their power. Whereas Spain, if you're the king of Spain, you have your power. You're backed by the Pope. You've just had your Reconquista where you have effectively kicked out anyone who is not like a devout Catholic or is not willing to pretend to be one, if that makes sense. So they're able to get out and kind of dominate this early age of exploration. But later on, they're not going to industrialize as quickly because industrialization comes with more of a free market, right? More like freedom, kind of property rights, that sort of thing. So that's why like England later is going to catch up and overtake them because they do have this constitution that makes things slow at the beginning. But if you feel like you have property rights respected, then like you're more willing to maybe risk your livelihood to start a business and go explore. I hope that makes sense. So this era is really dominated by Spain and Portugal. And the next era is going to be the era of like the British Empire. And then the last question about the East India companies, just keep in mind the West Indies, the West Indies are basically like this. And then the East Indies are like Southeast Asia. Again, that's why like when Columbus landed and he thought he was in India, he called it the Indies. And then once they realized his mistake, they started calling it the West Indies versus the East Indies. And so just keep in mind that like when we say the Dutch East India Company, that means like it's a private company sanctioned by the Dutch government to basically administer their colonies here, to like get spices, that sort of thing. Same, the British East India Company, same idea. It's just run by the British, right? And so in this era, we really have like the Portuguese and the Dutch are kind of dominating over here, right? In the next era is when it's going to be the British and the French. Again, I don't mean to like overcomplicate or actually oversimplify things, but it is important to understand that there are waves of colonialism happening. And it's not this overnight thing that like Columbus happens and now it's the European world, not at all. And the most important thing to also remember is that like land-based empires in Asia, they're not unaffected by this age of exploration, but they are not worried. They are still incredibly powerful. The Ottoman Empire is the most powerful empire, in my opinion, in this era still, right? The Mughals in India, the Ming dynasty in China is expanding. So yes, like the Europeans are they're kind of conquering, controlling the Americas. Okay, fine. That's sort of meaningless until they discover silver. And yes, they're starting to set up these like trading posts. But keep in mind, like Europeans are not coming to actually dominate really any part of Asia at this point. They're basically just entering the ring as a new trader. There's still like this Indian Ocean world is still dominated by Muslim traders. There's actually gonna be a lot of wars. It's not gonna be till the next era that we get full on imperialism. We get like the Europeans just dividing up Africa. We get the opium wars in China. We get the British Raj in India. That's the next era, right? So it's like it takes hundreds of years to build up enough power to actually take over and take down some of these Asian empires, which is really important, right? That's why we talked so much about them in the first era, is because like, okay, what are they doing? Because they're going to last and be incredibly successful for a very long time. All right, cool. Skimming through the questions. Gunpowder Empire is a really good question. Why didn't they just take over everyone else? They kind of did. I mean, they sort of did, right? So one of the themes of this era is basically, if you notice, all the places where the Mongols conquered, basically wherever the Mongols got, all of a sudden out of the ashes of the Mongol khanates that kind of like lose power, rise these gunpowder empires. And I want us to think about how much bigger these empires are from the last era, right? The last era, we had like the Song dynasty was like here. We had the Delhi Sultanate was like here. We had the Abbasid Caliphate was like struggling, holding on here, and the Byzantines were right there. I mean, literally, when we talked about these big states, they were actually pretty small, all things considered. And so now you can look and see the impact of gunpowder, where all of a sudden, like they are able to create these massive empires and actually administer them and like maintain control over them because of the power of guns. And the question of like, why didn't the Ottomans go further? Well, they tried to go further. I mean, they went pretty far, right? They made it all the way to the gates of Vienna, but then the Pope and kind of the various like Catholic powers, like especially Spain, sent troops over to kind of defend because they were like, that's too far, right? I mean, why didn't they go further down? Well, it's the Sahara Desert. I mean, if you look at an empire like the Ottomans, they really went almost as far as they possibly could. And then beyond that, they just had good trade relations with everyone, right? Okay, perfect. Keep in mind too, like French Revolution next is going to be next era, right? So again, like this era is absolute monarchies, consolidating power. This is the French building Versailles. The next era is going to be the Enlightenment and revolutions and tearing those things down. Cool. Okay. You're asking some really good questions too in the chat that I will get to. All right. Here is the main idea for Unit 3. So the way the College Board sort of does this, which kind of helps us keep this straight in our head, is they kind of start, they're like, okay, for Unit 3, let's mostly focus on what's going on over here. They're like, let's kind of go along with kind of what we were already talking about in Units 1 and 2. Let's look at this same world, kind of the Silk Road, kind of Indian Ocean world. And let's just see like, cool, what is happening in Unit 3? And really the big question is like, what are states continuing to do that they were doing in the last era? Remember in Unit 1, we talked about is like, how are states gaining and maintaining power? Okay, great. How are these new states doing it? Are they continuing things that were being done before? And are they doing new things, right? And the short answer that y'all have already predicted in the chat is the newest thing is the new technology they have. They have gunpowder. They have something all of a sudden that can give whoever controls the guns and controls the gunpowder an enormous amount of power. But then you'll also find that they're also just continuing a lot of other things. They're using belief systems to unite people or to maybe like divide against their enemies. They're continuing a lot of the same tactics that like the Song dynasty did, that the Delhi Sultanate, whatever did. They're just doing it on a bigger scale. So Unit 3, they throw in some examples from like the Aztec and the Inca, just to remind you that they're still around during this era, but you can really focus most of your time on like, okay, what's happening in kind of the old world? Basically, this is Unit 1 continued. Okay, and so let's look. So compare methods by which various empires increase their influence. This is the main idea of Unit 3. If they're going to ask you an essay from this unit or something, it is probably going to be related to how states are increasing their influence and their control. That might be how rulers are doing it. How are rulers consolidating their power with the people in their country? That might be how is one state expanding their influence against other states. But that's really the idea here, is that what started out as kind of little baby states, the Song, the Abbasid, the whatever, are now growing into like big guy states that have gunpowder. And like, what are they doing to make sure that they can maintain control over these ever increasing empires? So we've already talked about this. How did land-based empires expand? It's really gunpowder. Like, cannot overstate the importance of gunpowder. Keep in mind, when we say gunpowder, it's still very archaic, right? So it's in this era that they start, the Ottomans really are the first to use like real big cannons to knock down walls, but even then the cannons more often explode than they do actually work. So again, we're not to like fully modern armies, right? Again, that's going to be kind of in the next era. But basically, if you can control gunpowder, and the other thing too is if you are willing to adopt gunpowder technology, this is the other thing too, is like we're from the future and we now know how important guns and gunpowder are going to be. But they didn't at the time. At the time, there was a pretty decent argument for like, these are more trouble than they're worth. I mean, remember when like the first English settlers like John Smith came over and were founding Jamestown, the indigenous people literally thought that the point of a gun, well, they called it a noisemaker. They thought the whole point was to make a loud noise to scare you and have smoke come out. They didn't even realize the point was to like shoot you because they were so bad. So again, there were a lot of states, especially if you're China. I mean, come on, China's been crushing it. China's had access to gunpowder for a really long time and they've been like, not worth it. We're more concerned about nomads on horseback. We're more concerned about other things. Guns aren't going to be that helpful. So part of this is how willing are some of these really old established states going to be? How willing are they to take on this new technology? And the answer is the Ottomans are a new power that rise up, and they're gonna probably be the best at like taking this technology and using it to expand. Looking at the chat too. Oh, great. Devansh, we're going to talk about religion in just a second. The other answer to this is just technology, like navigational technology, right? That's going to allow like the Portuguese and the Spanish empires to expand. But again, this question is really focusing on land-based, so it's really mostly gunpowder. All right, this now is to Devansh's question. How did rulers legitimize and consolidate their power? This is the most important topic of Unit 3. This will show up. It will either be a short answer question, or it will be a multiple choice set, or it will be an essay prompt. Rulers, this is like the main idea of Unit 3, is that rulers are attempting to consolidate their power. And here's what that means. In the last era, especially when they didn't have control of like guns and a professional army, they were really, if you were the king, let's say you were the king of France, let's say you were the Abbasid Sultan, you had a lot of power, but a lot of that power was based on just people believing that you were the king. And like, if they actually called you on it, you really had to rely on like local armies to defend you. You really had to rely on like feudal lords bringing their knights and their, soldiers or whatever to you. You didn't have professional armies before this era. The Ottomans are the first to be like, maybe we should just have soldiers who like are always soldiers and just always serve the Sultan. I mean, obviously they had that back in the Roman Empire, but it kind of went away. And so one of the things that's happening in this era is that these rulers who were kind of like figureheads, they were powerful maybe in the capital city, but if you were way on the outskirts, you didn't really care what the king said, right? You cared maybe what your local lord or your local ruler said. Well, now they're like, I want to change that. I want to make sure that every place within my empire actually is loyal to me. And one of the main places they're going to take that power from is other elites. So what's happening right here at the top is there's this power struggle across most empires, in China, in the Ottoman Empire, in Mughal India, in early modern Europe. Basically, you have a king, a sultan, or whatever the name is, attempting to take power away from traditional elites, the nobility, and like take it over for themselves. And there's a lot of strategies that they're doing. One is going to be monumental art and architecture, basically creating this almost like theater state of like, I'm going to make it so clear to everyone in France that I, the King of France, am like the sun god, Louis XIV, that it will be very hard for the nobility to ever try to overthrow me. So there's that. There's creating almost this personality cult behind whoever's the leader. So a great example of that would be these huge shows of wealth and power. So the building of Versailles as like the personal palace, and also saying, hey, and by the way, all the nobles, guess what? You get to come live with me at Versailles. How lucky for you. And the nobles aren't happy about that, right? Like it sounds fun. If you've seen Marie Antoinette or something, it seems like a fun party, but it actually wasn't, because what was happening is if you were, let's say you were a local lord, let's say you were a baron or whatever, you had a ton of power in your land. You owned a ton of land in rural France, and you were basically like the king of your little region. Well, now the King of France says, oh, guess what? I'm inviting you to permanently live in my court at Versailles. You have to leave your family behind or bring them with you. And now you have to pay double the money to keep up whatever you need. You're being separated from your friends. You're being separated from your knights, your soldiers who would like be loyal to you. And you're now like literally under the same roof as the king, and he's keeping his eyes on you, right? So this is a power move that rulers are doing. The Japanese do the same thing. The shogun says, hey, guess what? If you were one of those really powerful warlords that I just defeated in this big war for control of Japan, guess what? I want you to come live with me in Tokyo every other year. So yeah, 1 year you'll go back to your family. 1 year you'll go back and like administer your little area. You'll still have to keep a home there, but then the other year you'll come live with me in Tokyo. And you know what? Your wife and kids, they'll just stay with me in Tokyo all the time. He's holding them hostage, right? So that's one very literal way that rulers would try to take power from the nobility, is be like, now you serve me, and like you are now loyal to me, and I'm gonna force that into you. We also see a really interesting development, which is the creating of like military elites, these new kind of professional military units that are recruited by and directly loyal to the ruler. So the best example of this is the Ottoman process of devshirme, which is like recruiting and getting janissaries. This is this really interesting, controversial process. Like, I would not condone it today, but it is actually a really interesting, innovative practice where basically the Ottoman Sultan, he conquers a lot of Christians in Eastern Europe. Muslims are not allowed to enslave other Muslims. but he conquers a bunch of Christians in Eastern Europe. And he goes, you know what? I'm going to have them pay tribute. They're basically, each of these places I conquer is going to have to pay me tribute. They're going to have to send a certain number of their sons, their young boys. They're going to come to me in the capital. They're going to be trained. They're going to be educated. They're going to be whatever. And they're going to become my professional elites. So they're going to become either my professional elite soldiers, or if the really smart ones are going to become like my professional bureaucrats. They're going to help me run the government. So it's this really weird thing where it's like, yes, they're enslaved, right? They're enslaved. They're forced to convert from Christianity to Islam. They're taken from their families. But then they're like way promoted to become like the most elite on either side of like the government and the military. And what the Sultan is doing is saying, like, you're loyal only to me. You owe everything to me, as opposed to like traditional elites who already had all their power and could kind of like, hold sway in their land. So it's another interesting example. This is also what like the Japanese shogun does when he creates a salaried samurai. He's like, hey, warlords that I just defeated in this war, you don't need samurai anymore, right? Because we're all peaceful again, right? I just conquered you, so you definitely don't need your samurai anymore. Guess what? You won't have to pay for your samurai anymore. I'll pay for them. You're welcome. And again, it's a power move. The daimyo in Japan are mad about that. They're like, he's literally taking my fighters away, but he's veiling it as like, I'm so generous, I'm going to pay for your samurai, and they will now be a professional military force to protect all of Japan. But really what it is like under me, not under you, right? So these are some of the different ways that they're kind of legitimizing their power. Professional militaries. We also see some states recruiting and creating their own kind of bureaucrats. So the Ottoman tax farming system, or the Mughal zamindars, is basically the Mughal emperor like appointing a local elite to say like, hey, you're basically in charge of administering this whole region. You can kind of do whatever you want as long as you follow my laws and as long as you pay me the taxes. And if you want to charge more for taxes and like skim off the top, that's fine. But you got to make sure that everyone's loyal to me. So there's all these different strategies for these rulers to figure out, how can I continue to control this ever increasing empire? Cool. Let's see. And a really good question from Pierce: how fast are these gunpowder empires going to fall? Really slowly, because keep in mind, right? I mean, let's go back to this map. If we think of like, let's think of the biggest gunpowder empires. We're talking about the Ottomans. The Ottomans don't fall till World War I, right? We're talking about Russia. The Russian Empire doesn't fall till World War I, right? We're talking about the Ming. The Ming are going to fall to the Qing, right? But that's going to be in a few hundred years. And the Mughal and these other states don't really fall till the British take them over. So again, these gunpowder empires are truly going to be incredibly long lasting. What's happening is that in this era, they're still at their height. In the next era, they're starting to shrink in power. And then by like around 1900, they've sort of collapsed, essentially. But it's still incredibly impressive how long they last. Okay. Oh, great question, Melissa. So how effective was like military-based legitimacy compared to religious? I mean, the ideal is if you could combine both. So the ideal, right, is if you can combine your belief system with like military power, and that's what most of them were doing. I mean, think about the Aztec Empire, right? That's a great example of like an incredibly powerful military control tributary system justified by the belief that they need to like feed their gods, and that the emperor is sort of like a god on earth. And a lot of states are doing that. This is where in Europe we start to have this philosophy of divine right to rule. So this is when we start to have this idea that like my family is blessed by God and our blood is blessed by God to rule for forevermore, right? And so that's one of the ways that they're legitimizing their power, is just saying, don't worry about it. God chose us. You don't ever have to worry about who's going to be your ruler again, right? As opposed to other empires before them, which made them last longer. What was different about this type of rule? That's a really good question. I think what's different, I don't want to like oversell gunpowder, but y'all, it's like gunpowder. I mean, think about the power of like trying to assert your control over these like outlying regions, and you have guns and they don't. It just like, it's not even really fair. But I think what's also happening is just like the growing complexity of these empires. And keep in mind, we've had massive, powerful empires in history before. I mean, think about we had the Roman Empire and stuff like that. So these aren't new. It's not like they're the first ever to be this big. Think about, we had the Mongols, right? but it's just that they're going to be able to last longer, partly because they're going to have more wealth that's going to start coming in from the New World. And they're also going to be able to kind of unite their empire against outside enemies, which is what's going to start happening in Unit 4 and beyond, right? It's like if you're the Ottomans and you can say, look, I know you maybe don't like all the things we're doing inside, but we're all Muslims and we need to unite against the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, right? It's going to be a way for them to stay united longer than maybe before when, you know, every state was smaller and there was like not as many massive threats. Okay. The other thing that's happening in this time period is that in the last era, 1200 to 1450, belief systems were the unifier. Like belief systems were the main uniting force, because you kind of had, I'm way oversimplifying, but you kind of had like one big belief system per region. So you had like Dar al-Islam, and yeah, there was Sunni Shia, but it was mostly just Dar al-Islam against the world. In China, you had Confucianism. In Europe, you had medieval Christianity. What happens, though, as technology advances, as people discover and the world becomes more interconnected, as people start to be able to read, print books and read them themselves, those religions start to fracture. So in this era is when we have internal fighting within religions. This is when we have the Protestant Reformation that just sends Europe into chaos. I mean, Europe is literally like hundreds of years, Catholics and Protestants constantly fighting. And again, the states that were having those problems were often the ones that were a little bit slower to start exploring the world, because England's busy trying to figure out if they're fine with having a Catholic queen or a Protestant queen or whatever, right? Same thing though, we have these different gunpowder empires that are Sunni or Shia. And so now they're like turning their guns on each other. They're starting to develop these new philosophies of like, well, I know it says that Muslims aren't supposed to kill other Muslims, but we're Sunni and they're Shia and they're basically a different religion, which is what's happening with Protestants and Catholics too, right? So this is going to be another fuel for building up your own nation. And if you're the ruler, consolidating your power, if you can make yourself the head of like, I am like the face of, if you're Philip II of Spain, the Catholic Church, oh my gosh, that's a ton of power, right? The Habsburgs in Europe are going to have so much power because they are the favorites of the Pope, right? If you're Queen Elizabeth in England and you can say like, I'm your Protestant Virgin Queen, it's a ton of power. Keep in mind, there were other states who wanted to avoid this and tried to create unifying religions. So we also have like Akbar in the Mughal Empire who tries to create this new divine faith. He's like, hey, we're all actually more similar than we think. Like, I'm going to create a new faith that actually mixes together like Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, all kind of into one thing. It just never took hold, right? And same thing, Sikhism comes about in kind of northwestern India, and it's an interesting mix of basically Hindu and Muslim beliefs. So we have like some religions are breaking apart and dividing states, and we have some examples of states trying to actually go the other way and trying to unite. But for the most part, it's dividing. We should also think about, we haven't really talked about the New World yet, but this is also happening in the Americas, right? Is like the forced conversion to Christianity, but then are they developing their own? Are they kind of mixing their indigenous religion with Christianity, right? The same things are happening in the New World. We'll just talk about them more in a second when we get to Unit 4. At one point were gunpowder empires no longer considered gunpowder empires? Essentially when everyone was a gunpowder empire. So essentially, once this unit is over, every empire is a gunpowder empire. They're all using it. The reason why we call like the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Ming, the reason why we call them gunpowder empires is just because they were the earliest to adopt it, right? But once everyone else starts to adopt it, it's like not a unique thing anymore, right? Okay. Let's see. All right. Now, Unit 4. Unit 4 is massive, but is actually really simple. Unit 4, this is what the College Board says they want you to know. They want you to be able to explain how economic developments, and what they're really talking about is like exploration, colonization, the discovery of the New World, the slave trade, the silver trade, all that kind of stuff, Columbian exchange. Those are all kind of economic developments. How are they affecting social structures over time? What this means is this is a change and continuity unit. This is a unit where if you get a writing prompt, it's going to be talking about changes and continuities. It's going to be talking about like, to what extent did labor systems change as a result of the discovery of the New World and blah, blah, blah. And you're going to argue either they did and here's why, or they didn't and here's why. To what extent did traditional elites lose power in this era? Essentially, what's happening is that with the discovery of the New World, the whole world order is getting shook up, right? And it's getting mixed up. And we're all of a sudden going to start to have new opportunities for wealth, new opportunities for subjugating other people, right? We're having all these different groups coming into more consistent contact with one another. And so this is the era where everyone's kind of sorting out the new hierarchy. Wait, who's now on top? Is it people who own a bunch of land back home in England, or is it a guy who has a bunch of money from exploring the New World? Who's more powerful? We're not sure. And same thing, who's more powerful? Is it a European explorer or is it an African king? Right? So this era is a lot about like different social hierarchies clashing, coming into contact with each other, and then being often violently sorted out to figure out like what is going to be the new hierarchy, which in the next era ends up becoming essentially white supremacy. It's going to end up becoming white supremacy and European imperialism, right? But this is the era where it's being kind of sorted out and fought, they're fighting it out. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So one question that the College Board is obsessed with is about trade and labor systems. Unit 4 is an economic unit. Unit 4 is about economics, it's about trade, it's about labor. And these are euphemisms, like a new labor system is a euphemism for like the slave trade and chattel slavery, right? Which involves humans and is a social thing. But ultimately, the College Board is interested in the new economy that's developing, right? So thinking about how did trade and labor systems change? Well, man, they just explode. They get so much bigger, right? Whereas before the Silk Road was maybe the Indian Ocean trade routes were like the biggest we could think of. Now we literally have direct routes from like silver mines in Mexico all the way over to China and then all the way back to Spain. It's literally connecting the entire world together. And labor systems, we're still using mostly, we're actually increasing coerced and semi-coerced labor systems. So that's something that's happening is like we're continuing to use these coercive or coercive labor systems. So think about feudal Europe in the last era that had serfdom. Okay, well now we have indentured servitude, but we're also taking it up a level and having chattel slavery, right? Which is it's a new form of slavery that is even more intense than forms in the past because it is a permanent status and it like descends through the offspring. So the idea of chattel slavery is that before, yes, we had slavery and you had Africans being enslaved, but it was because they were in debt, it was because they were a prisoner of war, and it didn't impact their families, except that they were probably taken away from their families. Chattel slavery is a new system where it basically dehumanizes the enslaved person entirely and says, you are enslaved forever for no reason other than what's going to become the color of your skin, and your children will forever be enslaved. It's this whole new kind of permanent system that develops in the Americas. So that's new. Right? But we also have indentured servitude happening. We also have encomiendas in Latin America, which are really similar to like the feudal kind of manorial system back in Europe, right? So again, it's like change over time. It's like to what extent think about all your spice themes, right? To what extent is the economy changing over time or not? To what extent are political systems changing over time or not? That's kind of what we talked about in Unit 3, so on and so forth. Let's see. Y'all are asking really good questions. How did the emergence of the new global trade network impact prior trade networks like the Indian Ocean Basin? That's a very good question. I'm really glad you asked this. Okay. Still, in this era, 1450 to 1750, the most important trading region is still the Indian Ocean, right? There's just now a second one that's like, it's almost equally important, which is the Atlantic, right? But the thing I guess that I want to make sure that we remember is that, again, it's not like Columbus sails the ocean blue and now Europe dominates the globe. Columbus sails the ocean blue and then Europe kind of comes to dominate this half of the globe over time. But this half, the eastern half, is still continuing in what it was. It's still these powerful Asian empires. The Indian Ocean trade is still where everyone wants to get. Keep in mind that when Europeans, like when the English and the French finally got their act together and went over to North America, if you remember, they spent the first 100 years not really settling. They were just trying to get across North America to get to Asia. they kind of like didn't even realize, oh my gosh, this is some incredible land that we could settle down on. It took them a while because they're like, is there a Northwest Passage? How do we get through? They just saw the Americas as an obstacle because they still really wanted to get to the Indian Ocean. So to your question of like, how much did it change it? Not a lot, actually, in this era. The big change in the Indian Ocean world is just the Portuguese show up. And that was the topic of a DBQ at least a year or two ago. And it was like, to what extent did the Portuguese showing up kind of change the Indian Ocean world? And the answer was like, not a lot, right? They're just like, it's one more trading group to contend with, but it's still going to be this really diverse, no one state is like controlling the Indian Ocean. Like in the next era, it's going to be kind of the British and the French. Okay. Let's see. Oh, main differences between the encomienda and hacienda system. I would not worry about it too much. I'm going to oversimplify it though. Encomienda is the first system, and it's essentially like directed by the king. Like if I'm the king, I say, hey, you are going to be my viceroy of Mexico, and you are going to get this huge chunk of land to divide up amongst your loyal people as you see fit. And so they might hand out an encomienda, a huge swath of land to some person and say, great, you're now in charge of all this land. You are directly in charge of all the indigenous people on it. They have to work for you. Do with them what you will, as long as they're Christian. Then there was some protest within the Catholic Church. There was a priest who was like, hey, actually, I think indigenous people are human beings. And I actually think this is not a Christian thing that we're doing. And so the hacienda system was like a little bit of a PR move. It was like, okay, we're not going to have encomiendas anymore. We're going to have haciendas. They're going to be private estates. And the people on there will have to be paid. So if they're indigenous people working, you'll have to kind of pay them to work the land. But ultimately, like, not a lot really changed, but it is a difference. Like, it kind of moves the Spanish world in the Americas a little bit away from this like chattel slavery mode, even though they had that on like sugar plantations. But basically it's where, okay, indigenous people are still subservient to the new colonizers, but they're not actively like enslaved and tied to the land. For the most part, they kind of just end up having to stay where they are, because where else are they going to go? Apartheid is going to be way later, although I don't know what you mean by apartheid, but like apartheid is specifically kind of South Africa, and that's going to be in the next era when we get to the full-on colonization of Africa. Okay. Here is a big key. And I guess I want you to notice how little time I spent on, we didn't talk about any explorers. Don't worry about it. Do not go through and memorize like cabeza de vaca and whatever. Like if you only know 2 explorers, okay, here are the ones maybe to know. Columbus, because duh, right? So I would know Columbus, and I would know Vasco da Gama, who was the first to go around Africa and reach India for the Portuguese. That's it. Like, you're not going to be asked, like, which of these explorers is the one who rounded the Cape of Good Hope? And you're going to, like, it's just, we don't care. The explorers have already had their day in the spotlight. With the College Board doesn't really care that much. Like, yeah, we should know about like, oh, they did it for God, gold, and glory. But all of that, we're way more concerned with like, okay, what happens after they get there? You don't need to spend much of your time memorizing like the explorers and all the different types of sails or whatever, right? One thing I'll say, of course, is the Columbian exchange, right, is going to be something that's important. But you can kind of simplify that down, right? Understanding that like, what's essentially happening is what's coming from the New World back to the Old World is almost entirely beneficial, because it's what the Europeans are going and choosing to bring back. And also the New World doesn't have many diseases that the Europeans aren't already accustomed to, because they don't really have a lot of domesticated animals they've been living nearby. So the one they have is syphilis, and that gets the Europeans pretty bad. That's why all the Enlightenment guys were wearing wigs, is because a lot of them were losing their hair because they all had syphilis. Anyway, so from the Americas coming over, it's mostly going to be incredibly beneficial crops: potatoes, tomatoes, beans, sugar, maize, right? I mean, these incredibly nutrient dense crops that are going to cause actually population booms in Africa and Europe. Even with the slave trade going on, the population is increasing because of all these new foods that are allowing more people to live for longer and live healthier. The other way, it's going to be bad things. And by that, I mean some just inherently bad things like disease that wipes out at least 90% of the population of the Americas. But also, it's just going to be like new domesticated animals that are going to transform the environment of the New World. So it's going to be horses, it's going to be pigs, it's going to be cattle, which are going to then come to dominate the land of the New World and kind of change their economy to be one that is like serving the old world. Like your job, Brazil, now is to grow sugar for us, right? Your job now, British North America, is to grow tobacco for us, right? And so a lot of them are going to be like, they're going to bring over crops or animals or whatever to use the land to basically turn the Americas into like a cash crop farm to feed back home and to like mine like silver and gold to then get something of value that like China and India want. Because up till this point, the Europeans didn't really have a lot. When they would go to China, they'd be like, we have sheep, we have wool. The Chinese are like, cool, we have silk, we're fine. Well, now if they have silver, now they start to have a currency that is sort of recognized around the world as valuable. And that allows them to like get in the door in Asia, right? Okay. So the other big question is, how is state power challenged? The College Board wants to make sure that you understand that Europeans don't just like show up in the Americas and then everyone else is like, well, I guess our time's up. I guess we're part of the European colony now. There was a ton of early resistance. This is one too where you might get confused because there's tons of examples of resistance movements in this era, and then there's more in the next era, right? And so you might just want to know a few examples, maybe like in each part of the world. So for example, in West Africa, you have Ana Nzinga. I did a whole TikTok series on her. She's really fascinating. But in West Africa, right, she's this like West African queen that's kind of fighting against the Portuguese and then allying with the Dutch to fight the Portuguese, right? In North America, we have Metacom's War, which is in like New England, fighting against the English settlers. We have other forms of resistance too. We have cultural resistance. So in Mexico, or what is now Mexico, the indigenous people basically adopted Catholicism, but they mixed it with their own indigenous beliefs. So we have like Our Lady, the Virgen de Guadalupe, where basically they took the Virgin Mary and then they kind of mixed her with Tonantzin, who was the Aztec Mother Earth goddess. And so that's why when you see like the Virgin Mary in Mexico, she looks very different. She looks a little bit more indigenous. She's often surrounded by natural elements, animal bones, that sort of thing. That's an example of them kind of mixing their culture together. So you can see that as a sign of resistance as well, right? Same thing like enslaved Africans who are kind of creating new religious forms, taking West African traditions and turning them into like voodoo, for example, and other forms, or even adopting Christianity like in the American South, but using it as a way to like argue for their, humanity, that sort of thing. So know some examples. You don't need to know every example of resistance, but I would know some examples in the Americas and in probably like West Africa of resistance that's going on early in this time period. And for the most part, it's not going to be successful resistance, at least long term, it's not going to be successful, but still. Okay. Let's see. Oh, a good question. College Board had officially come out. Yes, there's no DBQ on units 1 and 2. They've told us that in the course guide. They're like, the DBQ won't be from units 1 and 2. It'll be from unit 3 or on. And yes, what I was just describing is religious syncretism, right? So this is, different religions mixing together and creating something new. But I would also think about it as a form of resistance because it's syncretism from the conquered people saying, okay, I'm not going to give up some of my original traditions. I'm going to mix them with the ones you're forcing on me. And I'm going to create something new that's like just for me. So yes, it's syncretism and it's kind of like from the bottom up, if that makes sense, right? Okay. The last question that is a really important one, the College Board has said, like, this is a main focus of this unit, right? So the kind of main idea of unit 3 is like rulers consolidating their power. One of the main ideas of unit 4 is social hierarchies getting totally disrupted and changed. And so essentially what you want to think about is that you want to think about, there's the social hierarchy between nations. There's like the Spanish conquering what's going to be New Spain and creating a new hierarchy that has like peninsulares at the top, born on the peninsula, Iberian Peninsula, then it has Creoles, and then it has mixed race people, right? You have that. The same thing is happening in North America, right? With the English settlers coming and kind of forcing out the indigenous people, then having like chattel, black, enslaved people, right? So you have new hierarchies getting created when two or more states come together, right? And one is going to put themselves on the top of the other. But you also have social hierarchies within those powerful states changing. So one thing that's happening in Europe, social hierarchy is changing in a way people aren't really noticing in Europe just yet. Europe, remember, it was still like, if you owned land, that was power. That was it. You were the nobility. You were born into a noble family that gave you power. That's starting to change in this era because there's all of a sudden the new world provides these new opportunities for people. All of a sudden, if you're not noble and you weren't born into this big landed estate, but if you're willing to get on a ship and go to the new world and like tough it out in the swamps of Jamestown, then you could actually develop, like get a lot of land, and you could become like a landed person who has a lot of money and influence, right? Or if you decide that maybe you have a lot of money, but like money wasn't seen as very powerful, it was land, but you had a lot of money. Well, all of a sudden you could start to invest in these companies, British East India Company, Dutch East India Company, and you could get really rich. And just keep in mind that back in Europe, a lot of the traditional elites don't know what to do with that. It's almost like this new money idea. It's like, ugh, new money, like, but he's not a baron. Okay, yeah, he has more money than me, but he's not a baron, right? Or, oh, he's a lawyer. Ugh, what does a lawyer do, right? Like, but there's these new ways that you can work your way up. And we think about this generally as just a rising middle class. In medieval Europe, it was, you had the upper class and the lower class. You were either like noble or you were a peasant. There wasn't a ton of in between. There were like some craftspeople in between. But now think about how big and robust the middle class is getting. All of a sudden, these people exploring the new world, they're getting charters for their companies. They're becoming administrators overseas. And so they're able to work their way up. They're becoming part of the professional military. Think about the Janissaries are able to work their way from literally enslaved to maybe being like the top advisor to the Sultan. So all of a sudden, and a lot of rulers are capitalizing on that, right? Because again, they're trying to take power from the traditional elite. So if I'm the king of England or the queen of England, let's say I'm Queen Elizabeth, right? And I'm feeling a little threatened by some of the nobility, maybe some of the ones who until very recently were Catholic and don't seem to be super happy about having a queen. Well, it really benefits me then to find some, I don't know, like plucky young explorers who might want to go explore in my name, and I'll give them a charter and I'll give them a lot of privileges because I'm going to like find a new way to have like new wealthy people in my kingdom that owe it to me. And so you start to have like the Virginia Company that gets chartered, right? And they found Virginia in the name of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, right? So these things are like unit 3 and 4 are mixing together. Unit 3 at home, these rulers are trying to consolidate their power, and some of them are using this exploration, these new opportunities as a way to do it. They're saying, I'm going to kind of divide and conquer, where if the nobility aren't going to be always loyal to me, or I'm a little worried about them, well, great, I'm going to start creating my own kind of elite upper middle class that will be more, I don't know, subservient to me because I was the one that blessed their new business or whatever, right? If you think about it in France, what's happening is you have like Louis, the Sun King, you have the nobility stuck in Versailles, and you have this rising bourgeoisie who's like, well, yeah, we're powerful and rich, but you're telling us we're not at the top. And that's going to be the formula for like the French Revolution, right? Okay. And then just remember that most of the change is occurring in the Western half of the world. Most of the change is occurring in like Western Europe, Western Africa, and the Americas. Mostly in the Eastern half of the world, Asia, the Indian Ocean world, is continuity. It's just empires that are doing similar things, but on a bigger scale, right? And so what's happening is we're having, it's like, you can insert dramatic music of like, we know what's coming. We know we're gonna have this clash of like age of imperialism, opium wars, sepoy rebellion. Like we know what's coming in the next era. And this is like the prelude to that. You have Western Europe is like growing in power because they're taking over the quote unquote easier places to take over in the Americas and getting power from that. But they're like gearing up so that in the next era, they can turn their attention to who it's been all along, these really powerful Asian states. They've always just wanted to get to China. They've always wanted to get to India, right? That's what it's always been about. And so just keep in mind that this is still, they're kind of side by side. Land-based empires like the Ottomans are just as powerful, if not more powerful, than like the Portuguese maritime empire. But what we know is that these new European maritime empires are on the rise, whereas these older land-based empires are kind of on the decline. They don't know that. They're going to find that out. next unit. Okay. Okay, I'm going to skim through the questions. I want to mention a few things that, first of all, make sure you're following me. I have another live. I'm going to do another one a week from now on the next era. So if this was helpful, make sure, and I hope that the one I've scheduled will work, but if not, sorry. And I'm glad y'all were able to come find me. But definitely go follow me on TikTok and Instagram too. I'll be posting a lot of useful review stuff. I'll be making some essay predictions on where I think the College Board will probably want to give you some prompts where maybe they haven't in the past. And I also just want to mention that I do have some review materials for sale. Of course, all these YouTube reviews and stuff are free, but if you find these helpful, if you liked kind of the maps I was showing and stuff, you can find those at antisocialstudies.org, but it doesn't matter. If you don't want to pay for any review stuff, that's fine. I'll be here for free. Okay, I'm going to skim through the comments one more time and make sure there weren't any big questions I missed. Oh, we talked precious metals and the silver trade. That's a very good question. So the silver trade is a big change that's happening because before this era, the only source of silver in the world was Japan. And like, it was incredibly rare. So it was incredibly precious and rare. And really the only source of gold was like Africa, right? So these are incredibly rare, precious metals. When Spain especially discovers these silver and gold mines across New Spain, there's a silver mine in Potosi that's still running today. Like they still haven't found the bottom of the mine. Like they're still mining silver from it, right? All of a sudden that gives European countries something that Asian empires want. Because think about it, in the era before, everything that the world wanted was coming from Asia. It was innovations, it was silk, it was luxury goods, it was all coming from Asia. And the Europeans didn't really have much in return. Again, they're like, we have wool. Do you want some wool? Do you want some linen, right? Well, now if they have silver and gold, all of a sudden they can buy those things. So what's starting to change in the economy too, we're not getting it, we don't have like capitalism yet. What's starting to happen is the idea that like having gold and silver is a form of power. It feels weird to us now, right? But before, the gauge of like how much power you had was like how much land do you control, how many things of use do you have for people? So you having access to a lot of silk that a lot of people wanted was really useful. And having a bunch of gold was just like flashy, or like Mansa Musa, you throw it around to like show that you're shiny or whatever. Well, now the Europeans are trying to change the economic system and say, but actually this silver and gold can get me whatever I want. Right. And so actually, we're just as powerful as you because we can just buy all the things we need with silver and gold. That's what like, we're rising into like mercantilism, right? Where kings and queens in Europe are recognizing that maybe you're not producing the thing in Europe that everyone wants, but if you can go get a colony to produce it, and you can also go get all these like precious minerals and they all go through you, that's a new form of power, right? Again, it seems weird to think about now because we just think about like we gauge countries based on like GDP and dollars and stuff, but that's new. That idea that like money equals power is coming about in this era. Okay. With that, thank you so much for joining me. I hope this was really helpful. If it was, please like and subscribe. Please make sure that you let your friends know about the next review that's going to be happening next Sunday. I'll be saving this one on my page. So if you missed the first part because you were hopping over from the other link, it'll be saved and you can go back and watch it as many times as you need. I hope it was helpful and good luck.